Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Brandon Rickabaugh, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. We're going to be talking about consciousness and the unity of consciousness, different problems in philosophy of mind. I'm super excited for it. So let me just jump in. I'm not going to do anything else. I want to get this started. So without further ado, Dr. Rickabaugh, Brandon, thanks for coming on the podcast, man.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this too, Parker. Thanks for being interested in this.
Yeah, so I first heard, I think I first heard about you. I've seen your name around in like philosophy of Christie kind of stuff, but I think it was back in 2018 you wrote an article for the Trinity Journal, and it was against, I think it was McGrath's physicalism. Is that right?
Yeah, Alistair McGrath, yeah.
And I was so excited about that because at that time I was starting to get into the philosophy of mind and seeing its importance, and seeing you take him down cordially, but take him down, and then pulling in Hebrew and Greek, and it was awesome. So I want to get into that a little bit, but
Cool.
first, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your schooling, and how you got into philosophy of mind?
Yeah. My academic career, I'd say, began when I was 16 years old when I dropped out of high school.
Whoa.
So that's where it started. I went to, so I grew up in Southern California, and I went to the University of California at Irvine, and I did a bachelor's in philosophy there. And there I was really interested in epistemology and phenomenology, mostly. And then I went to Biola for the MA in philosophy of religion and ethics there. And so I studied, I started to shift and do more metaphysics, ontology, philosophy of mind there. And then I also spent a year after my degree there studying spiritual formation and soul care, although I didn't do it for a degree. And at the same time, I was teaching at Biola and then at Azusa Pacific. And then I came out to Baylor University to do my PhD in philosophy, and I focused on philosophy of mind, ontology of consciousness.
Yeah.
Still do some epistemology, but I have all these different. My projects are grounded fundamentally in the nature of, or what the nature of consciousness can tell us about the nature of human persons, what helps human persons flourish, and how can we know certain things. And then also how it impacts issues in the philosophy of religion.
Yeah, that's so awesome. How did you ever even get into phenomenology kind of stuff though in undergrad? Like where did that come from?
It's kind of funny. So I took an intro to metaphysics class, and David Woodruff Smith was the professor, and I didn't know who he was, but he's a big shot with phenomenology and Husserl in particular. And for this intro to metaphysics, we read Aristotle, and then we jumped all the way to Brentano and Husserl.
Right. Natural progression, yeah.
Right. And then we read some Frege, and then I think some Searle. So and I just thought that his bringing together of Aristotle and Husserl was really, really interesting. And so then he was teaching a class the next semester on time consciousness, and that was just a study of Husserl's work on time consciousness, and thought that was really fascinating and interesting. So it was in part, it was because he was David Woodruff Smith was there, and he was fun to study with. Yeah, and then I did epistemology with like Sven Bernecker, was really great. And, yeah.
Wow, man, that's awesome. And you brought that all the way into your dissertation with Aristotle and Husserl.
Yeah, I can't get rid of those guys.
That's so amazing.
Yeah. And then Alex Proust really like got me reading some, Leibniz and, some Spinoza, and yeah.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting to me about the philosophy of mind, is that it's kind of at this nexus of a lot of different subdisciplines in philosophy. And I think if you want to be a good philosopher of mind, you need to know all these. You need to know epistemology. You need to know, especially metaphysics. Then things get into philosophy of free will, and those conversations come up. Just so awesome. I think it's
such language, neuroscience. Yeah.
Yes. Philosophy of language, another one that I didn't realize.
Yeah. So I had a 1-year research fellowship that I just did at Baylor to study neuroscience.
Yeah.
because I thought, that was really important for the conversations in philosophy of mind, at least.
Yeah, it's huge. And I came into studying philosophy, and I had this chip on my shoulder about language analysis kind of stuff, and like, oh, you guys turned away from metaphysics and you're all jerks. And so I didn't like language philosophy until I started studying philosophy of mind, and then kind of went back in through Davidson and those kind of things to language, and realizing how important language is for philosophy of mind. And it's just been so cool. So one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, I'm so excited about, is because philosophy of mind is huge. It's super important for lots of different reasons, for Christian philosophy, Christian apologetics, for understanding personhood. In your mind, can you flesh that out for us? Like, why is it important for those disciplines?
Yeah, I think it's huge. And it's bizarre because I think I can count on one hand the number of Christian philosophers working in philosophy of mind.
Yeah.
And, 3 or 4 of the, 3 of them are retiring. So there's the, if I can encourage people, go to philosophy of mind. I think it touches on everything. So like, I think I said my overall projects in philosophy are centered on this sort of foundation of phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah.
And so this is a very sort of phenomenological approach to philosophy in the world. And so I think that consciousness is just one of the most, if not the most, intrinsically fascinating feature of reality. It's also it's the way that Chalmers and others introduce it. They say it's peculiar because it's the one thing that we're all intimately familiar with, yet it's deeply mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
Mysterious. And it's sort of one of the great mysteries right now that people are largely convinced we're nowhere near solving under a particular guise, under a particular research program. So I think it's intrinsically interesting. I think it's culturally relevant, and in particular, I think that the debates going on in transhumanism and artificial intelligence, and then the sort of what I call like the future magic view of neuroscience, that the idea that neuroscience is going to solve all of our psychological problems. Those 3 issues are central to what's going on and will become even more important as culture moves forward, especially with artificial intelligence. Yeah. And so understanding for example, like if my dissertation or now this book that I'm writing on is right, there's just we will never have computers or anything that are conscious like that.
Yes.
Right. So that's important for 2 reasons. One, if ethical knowledge requires, like most people think, having emotions or feelings, and computers can't have emotions or feelings, then it seems like they're not going to be able to have moral knowledge. And if they can't have moral knowledge, then we ought not trust them with many things.
Yes.
Right? And but at the same time, if they could be conscious, then we face the ethical dilemma of turning a computer off is akin to killing it.
Right.
So that's a really key
it's
issue.
So good. There's so many trails I don't want to go down all of them, but I think of like iRobot, where Will Smith has this prejudice against robots because spoilers, it's been out for so long, but he has a prejudice against robots because one saved him instead of this child, because it did this inward, calculation and determined he is more valuable. And in that situation, it was actually representing, I would say, the ethical calculations of its operator, of whoever programmed it.
Right.
So it wasn't its own, even in that case, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly why places like Google have hired philosophers. So self-driving cars, this is a real ethical dilemma. You have to program into that some way of deciphering out who it's going to hit if it has to hit someone.
Yeah,
and that's a huge dilemma. So these issues about consciousness and what constitutes what the nature of a person is ought to guide and curtail the sorts of technology that we should develop. Right. So, in akin to, many people thinking that we just shouldn't have invented the atom bomb because that's way too much power for us to have. You might think that, artificial intelligence is the sort of thing that we need to be careful with. I think artificial intelligence is going to be extreme, and already is extremely helpful with all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And there's an important distinction to be made. Usually when people talk about artificial intelligence, they usually think about machines that are conscious.
Right.
And that's only one form of artificial intelligence. We're not anywhere close to having that.
Yeah.
When people talk about artificial intelligence now, it's just machines that are dark on the inside.
Right. And so here's a question that I've been wanting to ask a philosopher of mine. In the maybe neuroscience, but in like the computer science world, they talk about AGI.
Right.
And in the philosophical world, I have read Searle. I really like his arguments, even though his personal life is kind of messed up. But he talks about, strong AI and weak AI. Is AGI, is that like correlated? Is that strong AI? Are those the same things? Do you?
Yeah. So AGI, they're very, very close. So artificial general intelligence is going to be the kinds of AI that are conscious, right? And then you would have so that's what AGI is. It's the particular kind of artificial intelligence that are in science fiction,
right?
And like I said, we don't have anything close to that right now.
Yeah.
So it would be close to strong. In the Husserl's piece, I'm sorry, in Searle's piece, he's a little bit more after understanding, but that's a really good correlation there.
Okay. Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I love that. I love the cultural or the social, imaginary is kind of taken by this obfuscation on artificial intelligence, right? People look, there's this robot lady and she's going on talk shows and she's been granted human rights by Iran or whoever.
Yeah.
And all the computer scientists kind of laughing behind the scenes, like, it's not really AGI, but and all the philosophers like, no, that's not even close at all, dude. And if it is, then you turned her off. Like, what are you doing? That's morally egregious.
Right. So there are deep problems there. I think that philosophy of mind also is important for areas in ethics in general and epistemology. So for example, corporations can be held accountable, held morally accountable and sanctioned accordingly. But if my arguments are right about the unity of consciousness, anything with the particular kind of parts that we'll explain in a minute can't be conscious. So a corporation couldn't be a conscious entity.
Yeah.
And it couldn't have moral properties to be held accountable. What needs to be held accountable then are the people that constitute the corporation at a particular level. So this would mean, so I was talking with a friend, Brandon Paradise, yesterday. He's a law professor at Rutgers, and we were talking about this. And it's a way that lawyers are going to be really apprehensive about this, because it makes it the case that major executives cannot hide behind companies in order to enact things that are radically morally questionable. So that then I think the big thing that I'm interested in right now is applying philosophy of mind to the philosophy of religion, which there's not been done much work at all. I think you've got the cognitive science of religion that would be important. There's been very few people, if any, that have applied philosophy of mind to the cognitive sciences of religion. In that paper that you read on Alistair McGrath, I tried to do that. I think there's a lot of work to be done in natural theology that hasn't been done. One of the projects that I have for next year is a consciousness first project on natural theology, where I try to apply specific methodology in what I'm calling analytic phenomenology and issues in consciousness to issues in debates in natural theology. So, for example, the design argument. So there's a recently published paper where Philip Goff argues that the universe could design itself. It has a particular kind of cosmopsychist consciousness. And then you've got the arguments from consciousness, like Moreland and Swinburne and Adams and others have given. But I think there's other ways that you can apply it, particularly. So I have stuff on divine hiddenness that I think you can apply, understanding of what consciousness is, what perception is, and integrate that with certain psychological evidence, datum, to help us understand what's actually how to frame the issue of divine hiddenness in a new way.
Man, that sounds so interesting. That sounds so helpful. Yeah, there's the psychology at play. If it's directed a certain way, wouldn't recognize, I don't want to scoop or anything like that, but that sounds super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then it would impact issues in epistemology. People are really, really interested in social epistemology right now.
Yeah, big time.
But if my arguments are correct, then social groups cannot have epistemic properties, because something that epistemic properties are largely going to be properties that correlate with or require consciousness, and groups of people can't be conscious.
That's
if
so
if my argument is correct. If my argument is correct.
Right. That's so interesting, because these are deep, deep aspects of a subset of philosophy and philosophy of mind, which is huge. But it has these practical applications in social theory and what's going on today. It has aspects in law. I think both that law argument of the CEO not being able to hide behind his corporation, and different sociological groups not being conscious. It sounds like Ned Block's Chinese nation argument. Again, right? Together they don't. There's no consciousness that emerges out of putting these people in a certain relation or anything like that. So interesting.
Right. And there's, in philosophy of religion too, there's projects. Marilyn McCord Adams ends her famous paper on horrendous evils and the goodness of God by saying, look, there's this account that I've given about God being able to share in the mental states of Christ, or God being able to share in the mental states of ours, that is totally unclear and really needs to be fleshed out by philosophy of mind. And there are other issues too in Alston's work on the presence of the spirit and other sort of projects in the philosophy of mind. So that there's just a huge number of issues that are just waiting to be worked on, I think.
Yeah.
Applying philosophy.
That's huge. I think what's so encouraging to me is that you did do that work in neuroscience, because it seems like neuroscience is kind of taken, just from as an outsider, has taken a lot of the steam away from philosophy of mind. And now it sounds so cool to say, I'm a scientist, I'm a neuroscientist. And, Sam Harris claims to be like a philosopher of mind when he's in neuroscience scientist, and he picks and chooses which moniker to use when it fits him. But he's not a philosopher of mind. I don't think so. I mean, his work is in, so I think that's really cool that you're able to talk about both of those. And I think a good philosopher of mind ought to be able to have that conversation. Lord willing, man, I hope that this podcast episode will draw people into philosophy of mind. Lord willing, I'll go on and do some work following a lot of yours, which would be awesome.
That would be awesome, Parker. Yeah. So again, I don't want to be claimed. I'm not a neuroscientist, and I spent 1 year studying a particular area. So, but yeah, I think it's in the same way that philosophers, the other director of my dissertation, Tim O'Connor, is, and others have sort of worked as philosophers who check the neuroscientists and psychologists that are working on free will. I think there's work to be done by philosophers to check the neuroscience and psychology of consciousness.
Yeah.
So I think that's important work to be done.
That's huge. I grabbed a quote from your dissertation by Marilyn Robinson. It says, whoever controls the definition of the mind controls the definition of humankind itself and culture and history. I thought that was so huge. And it goes back to what you quoted, what's his name? I always forget names on the podcast. Panpsychist, external mind.
Philip Goff or?
No. Chalmers.
Oh, David Chalmers. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you quoted Chalmers there, and talked about how it's mysterious, but it's right here. Like, we are conscious right now. We are. It's foundational, and so important to try and get a grasp on. So we've talked about a little bit about culture and philosophy and importance there. We talked a little bit about Christianity, but something that is discouraging for me, I would say, is this new movement in Christian theology to be physicalists, to reinterpret and say, dualism was a hangover from Plato, and it's wrong, and it denigrates the body, and so Christians ought to be physicalists, and then we can kind of toss in some magic on how God holds together the unity of consciousness. But it's not through a substantial soul kind of thing.
Right.
And this is something that you've worked on, again, in that, at least in that one article, but I know you've done it other places too. So how does, well, I mean, I guess we just kind of talked about it, but the philosophy of mind is important for Christian theology because it can help be a check on the theologians as well, and the biblical scholars who want to say, no, this can't be true because of Plato. We need to reinterpret scripture and Christian doctrine.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's a couple important things to say there. One, I think that Christian materialism or Christian physicalism is easier to get away with when you don't get into issues of consciousness. If you just get into the metaphysical constitution of, an animal or the persistence of a person, it may be a little bit easier to make a case for materialism, although I still don't find it plausible. But if you focus on consciousness, the plausibility of physicalism, materialism, even assuming theism, is really, really low. Unless you want to posit some type of emergentism. But if you do that, then you've given up on providing an explanation, and you've just posit, because emergentism for the theist is largely going to be this issue of, well, God just makes a law, and when things get arranged in the right way, boom, you get a soul, or boom, you get consciousness.
Right.
We can talk more about that, but the second thing I think that's driving a lot of the work, so I see this in the work of Joel Green and Nancy Murphy in particular, is this misunderstanding that neuroscience has some sort of authority over philosophy and theology.
Right.
And that might be with certain things, right? I would not want, as a philosopher, or I wouldn't want a theologian to start giving me, qua philosopher, qua theologian, detailed advice on treating, like, say, depression or schizophrenia, right? So that's not, but when it comes down to the nature of a human person, the neuroscientific data really doesn't give us any decisive answer. And the data that's proffered by neuroscientists or by Christian physicalists is equally accounted for. It's underdetermined. It's easily accounted for by a dualist view too, and people like Nancy Murphy even admit to that. So I think there's this worry that, or there's this authority thesis about neuroscience that dominates and drives the kind of hermeneutic that people want to give, because the argument that dualism is a Greek idea is, one, just like historically naive, but two, so what? Like, if it was a Greek idea, Plato believed in a lot of things that are true.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So, and in that paper with Alistair McGrath, I try to get into those details.
Yeah. I think you did a great job on that as well. That's such a good point too. We could just say, common grace, or, the Pythagorean theorem, that's Greek as well. Right. So, we shouldn't use that anymore. That's such a great point. Well, so we've talked about, like, the importance of consciousness. Can we get into, like, a definition? Like, what are we talking about here? What is consciousness?
Good. Yeah. So the first way that you usually deal with consciousness is to begin with an ostensive definition, and that's just to consider a particular case and analyze it from the first person perspective. So imagine that you are, in a coma. You can't imagine that, because presumably you're not conscious. But as you come out of the coma, you start to get this sense of smell. You start to feel the heaviness of your body in the hospital bed. You start to feel or see the brightness of the lights. You start to hear a conversation going on. You start to get back these senses, and that seems to be the most simplest way to say you're an obvious way to say you're regaining consciousness, or you're gaining consciousness. So we start off by sort of pointing out that that's the thing that we're talking about. That's the phenomena we're talking about. And then philosophers are going to start making distinctions about types of consciousness. And since Ned Block, and I would say the vast majority of philosophers and neuroscientists think that this is a correct or at least useful distinction, and even many studies in neuroscience make this assumption, is that there's going to be a distinction between what Block calls phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. So let me get over here so that I can give you a, so I mean, this is the technical definition, and then that I provide anyway. I should say, I guess I want to say one thing here is that I am convinced that mental states are not states of consciousness, but that states, phenomenal states of awareness, are properties of persons. And so, there's no mental state without a person. And so the what is consciousness isn't this sort of state that's out there divorced from a person, but the person is the thing that's conscious. The subject is the thing that's conscious.
Yeah, there's no uninstantiated conscious states or mental states.
Yeah, so I call the thesis that I give in the book is subject necessity. For any state of consciousness, there is necessarily a subject of that state. So with that in mind, so here's the the definition of phenomenal consciousness I give. So for all mental states M, a subject S, so me, having this experience of seeing you, seeing an image of you on the computer screen. For all mental states M, a subject S having that mental state M is an instance of phenomenal consciousness when that subject being in that mental state involves them having a subjective experience, what it's like for S, what it's like for me to be in M.
Yeah.
So, and that's going to be distinguished between access consciousness, which access consciousness is going to be the case that, for all mental states M, a subject S having M is an instance of access consciousness, just when S being in M involves S as having access to the content of M. So there's going to be a difference between what it's like to experience seeing red and my ability to access the content of thinking about red. Those are going to be two different things.
Well, does that make, I never thought much about access consciousness, because I did a philosophy of mind research class with Arkady here, and I focused on qualia because I wanted to write a paper called Qualia Assurance. That's really, like, I took the whole class because I wanted to write that paper with that title. But
that's awesome. I have a book. No one can steal this now. I'm putting it out there.
Yeah, that's right.
I have a book that I want to write against naturalism called Rage Against the Machine.
Yes.
So we'll have to write, we'll have to come up with some dueling titles there.
Yes, man, that sounds awesome. Well, so I haven't focused on access consciousness, but is access consciousness like necessarily reflexive, like self-conscious, or?
No, usually self-consciousness is a type of phenomenal consciousness in the sense of it's an experience of your self-awareness.
So I'm not sure I understand, like, why we would need access consciousness, or what it's picking out different than phenomenal consciousness. Can you have a phenomenal conscious, a qualitative state that you don't have access to, I guess?
Well, you can have, that's a really good question. I want to think that what we're really after is that there seems to be a difference between my accessing a memory, for example, and the experience I have of experiencing the memory, or something like that. So you want to say something like that a mental state is available to me by introspection. Means that that I've got access to that conscious state.
Okay.
But phenomenal consciousness refers specifically to what it's like to experience having that mental state.
Okay.
Right. So you might think that computers might have access consciousness in that they can retrieve data, but they can't have phenomenal consciousness, or don't have phenomenal consciousness, because they don't experience what it's like to perceive or experience that data.
Yeah. That what it's like. That's why I focus more on phenomenal consciousness, because I think it's more important. It's more foundational. I wonder, this might be getting us down a rabbit hole, but I wonder if you could even have access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness, because even when you're accessing, right, it's like something that it's like to access that memory.
Right.
Maybe
Yeah. So there's a debate. Yeah. In cognitive phenomenology of whether or not cognitive states, some or all cognitive states, have, in virtue of having that cognitive state, a phenomenology to them.
Yeah.
So, what it's like to, a corollary would be something like phenomenal conservatism, that that something seems true to me is evidence that it is true. It's defeasible, right? And the strength of the evidence will vary, but that seeming state will be described as having an asatoric force that that correlates with how strong that evidence seems to me. And that seeming sounds like a phenomenal state, right? So think about when you first learned, look, if A is taller than B and B is taller than C, then A is taller than C. You have this, aha, oh, I get it. And that's an experience. And the cognitive phenomenologist will say that that is a phenomenal experience that you're having in a cognitive state.
Ooh, wow, that's interesting, because that kind of brings us into some aspects of epistemology and maybe even logic too, like seeing the consequence or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So Husserl does this. He thinks that the laws of logic don't need to be or are not presuppositions, but they're actually things. The knowledge of them you experience in contemplating them. They're actually they have a sort of they're known through an eidetic intuition. You think about it and it just makes sense, and the experience of it making sense provides evidence for you that they are true.
Yeah.
So they don't need to be assumed. In fact, some people think it doesn't even make sense to say that laws of logic are assumed. They're just present in your reasoning, and upon reflection, you get the evidence of them being true.
Yeah, that would make them
at least phenomenologically, maybe not metaphysically, but phenomenologically.
Okay.
And epistemically.
That's good. It's like the operating system on your phone instead of like an app on your phone, maybe.
Yeah, you might think. Yeah, so I think that's a loose analogy. It's just going to be, the difference is going to be between me. So in apologetics, for example, there are arguments that different kinds of transcendental arguments that say that you can't argue for or have evidence for the laws of logic being true. They have to be presupposed. But what have to be presupposed in order to count for those is God. And depending on the presuppositionalist, right, if it's a Van Tillian, then they're going to say the triune God. This view would say that no, you don't have to presuppose them. They're evident to you in reflecting on them and your experience in the world. And so that you're epistemically justified in believing them just because you experienced what Husserl calls the fulfillment of them in reality. But that's different, though, than saying that the metaphysical question about the existence of the laws of logic or how they map onto the world is best accounted for by theism.
Yeah.
That argument you could still make. And I'm actually pretty sympathetic to different forms of transcendental arguments. And I actually think there's one you can make from phenomenal consciousness. Dude, that's a little different. I hint at it in the dissertation.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we have a little bit of consciousness in there. I really like, and I think it's kind of ubiquitous in the literature. Nagel's what its likeness and is that is like, are you cool with that? You've said what its likeness, but is that following Nagel then? Like,
Nagel makes that sort of famous. What it's like, I'll never I can't ever know what it's like to be a bat because I'm not a bat. I can only know what it's like to be me. And I think that, the way that you want to distinguish a particular kind of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness in this case, is that feature of what it's like to experience that state.
Okay.
Where I think Nagel, what I think that is wrong about Nagel's, at least talk about it, is with him talking about mental states having that feature. as if there's this sort of qualia that hangs on something called a mental state.
Yeah.
And I want to say, no, a mental state is a modification of the person.
Yeah.
In virtue of which the person has what it's like to experience. So the property is attached to the person.
And you go that route because persons are mereological wholes.
Well, I go that route because I think that I can't consider a state of consciousness that doesn't have a subject, phenomenal consciousness, that is.
That makes so much sense to me. I think that's so right. But that has implications for like Descartes' cogito.
Right.
So people will say, people all the time, they say this, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you'll correct me, but they say, all Descartes' cogito proves, I think therefore I am, proves is that there's thinking going on. It's a famous, criticism of him from back in the day. And I think what you're saying right now would imply that, no, there is no such thing as just the property thinking hanging out there in the void. Thinking presupposes, or thinking is done by a thinker. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. And so like Descartes scholars like John Cottingham and Nicholas Joly will just point out that criticism of Descartes fails to understand how the Latin works or even how the French works. The way that he talks about so you'll also get this argument too from Christian theologians that Descartes reduces persons to thinking things.
Yeah, brains on sticks or whatever they say.
Right. Yeah. And they just are unfamiliar with Descartes' work. Mm-hmm. Because and also the Latin or the French, because what he counts as thinking includes emotions and would include phenomenal consciousness. And then to your question, he thinks require a subject of consciousness.
Yeah.
So there's got to be a subject there. So that's why I also think that it's really, really important that humans are fundamental entities, that persons are fundamental entities. Mm-hmm. That they function as a unit of explanation that's not reducible to the subpersonal level.
Yeah.
And that there are other arguments that, there's a publication I have with Todd Beerez on the argument from reason where we try to establish that. But that's another reason that I think it's really, really important to recognize this link of necessity between a state of phenomenal consciousness and the existence of the subject who has it. Yeah. There's a modal distinction. You can't have one. You can't have a phenomenal state without there being a subject that undergoes it.
Amen, dude. I love that. That's so good.
It's the first time I've ever gotten an amen on that. I like it.
That's awesome. I wonder. So I talked with philosophical theologian James Anderson on this, and I for the class last semester I read Swinburne's "Are We Bodies or Souls?" and Swinburne uses Descartes, and he soups up his arguments and says, there are thinking is a property, and there are no properties that are like uninstantiated or properties are had by substances. So from the fact that there is thinking going on, there's a substantial thing that is the thinker. And Anderson said, maybe we don't need to go that far. Maybe we just say that there's thinking presupposes a thinker, but maybe doesn't have to go into the metaphysical baggage of substances. Do you have a thought on that? Does this go? I know we'll get into that later if I'm jumping ahead, but
yeah. So I'm always reluctant to comment on another philosopher's thought or something. I know that's not what you're really asking me to do, but just for clarity, I'd want to say, well, let me talk with Anderson and understand a little bit more of what he means. Yeah. So
I don't think he's afraid of going.
Sounds like what he's saying is that the mere existence of a phenomenal state does not require a substance ontology, right? And so he might just be saying, look, we need an extra argument to get to a substance ontology. A bundle theory might be enough to account for a phenomenal for a mental state. And Sophie Gibb at Virginia is a dualist who argues, right? She's a substance dualist, but she doesn't hold that. She thinks that what a substance is a bundle of properties, not a sort of substance in the Aristotelian sense. So maybe if he means that, then I think, sure, there's an extra argument that needs to be given there. And I try to give that kind of argument in my chapter on emergence, actually.
Okay. Yeah, that's huge. I think he's trying to lower the bar for the argument. So if someone is really, really against the metaphysical categories there. He's saying, well, no, it's there's at least a subject. So even if you want to try and argue against, you still have to have a subject from the fact of, phenomenal consciousness or thinking going on.
Right. So I think we need to be careful there because, and this is in part why philosophers of mind are so reluctant to adopt this thesis I'm calling subject necessity. Mm-hmm. And that's because understanding what a self is does seem to require some pretty large metaphysical commitments.
Yeah.
Because you'll have views like, say, a stream of consciousness view of self, and all that is just some mental states that are causally related to each other. Mm-hmm. But you don't really have a subject that's differentiated from the mental states.
Yeah.
So understanding a self that way doesn't seem to do the work, or a narrative view of the self doesn't seem to make sense of, narratives aren't the sorts of things that have mental states. So I want to say, yeah, that seems right. We get a self, but things get snuck in there. It's going to be pretty quick that what a self is going to have to be some sort of thing that is the bearer of a property.
Yeah.
And standard metaphysics is going to call that, a substance. What counts as a substance, then we'd have to, work through.
Yeah. That's huge. I really like that. I think that I got to chew on that some more. I think that's awesome.
But as a rhetorical strategy, I think Anderson's right. Like, let's just see if the argument works for a self and then move on. E.J. Lowe does this kind of thing, but then he gives this real strong argument that it has to be a substance, metaphysically simple substance.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I used to think of Descartes as the boogeyman because I am a Van Tillian myself, and Van Til is pretty hard on Descartes.
Here I was like explaining Van Til to you, and you.
People at home are probably laughing. I'm closer to Anderson and his interpretation, but I read Descartes for myself in a classics class here at TEDS. And I was like, man, I really like this. I really like what he's doing. He is not as crazy as I've heard. I do not think that he set up the subjective turn the way that, Francis Schaeffer said and stuff like that. And I do appreciate him a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, historically, that's just false. So it's not. Malebranche is the one who really should be, a student of Descartes is the one who really, just sociologically brings those things into the discussion.
Yeah.
So Descartes is a bit of a mess in many ways because, there's a group of more recent Descartes scholars that argue that he is in many ways a neo-Aristotelian.
Yeah.
Because he talks about the body as he talks about the soul as the form of the body, and so Descartes there's a lot of nuances to look through there, and I don't think the simple sort of ways that he gets interpreted do him justice.
Yeah. Well, and I think you may have talked about that in your McGrath article. Somewhere you've talked about that connection there, and I was blown away. I thought that was so crazy to see that. Yeah, because you don't.
I was too when I found that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So going.
You might think too. I'll just add this in too. Yeah, in terms of just like reading Descartes, I think it's pretty clear if you read more of his literature that what he's doing there in the Meditations is not so much giving us an ontology of the human person, so much as giving us a treatment he dedicates the Meditations to the church as a defense of Christianity.
Right.
His main argument there is to try to give an argument for God's existence and that we can know it.
Yeah.
And so he just makes an assumption of skepticism. If you read the rest of his work, he doesn't buy skepticism. Mm-hmm. He's not a radical skeptic like that. And he's not like a radical Platonic dualist,
right,
that most people do. And you might get that just from reading the Meditations, but if you read his fuller body of literature, that's just not the case.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think I really like the Cogito because I think he is arguing in transcendental fashion. Maybe I'm wrong. But then right after that, he goes into his ontological argument for God. And whether that's successful or not, he's trying to do what Van Til wants to do. And I think that's hilarious. That it's like, he's not this boogeyman. Just take what you can. And if certain arguments fail, then soup them up or drop them, but at least appreciate him for what he's trying to do.
Right. Yeah, I don't think he tries to get the Trinity like Van Til wants.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's a really good point, I think. And I'm not a Cartesian either.
Yeah.
So, so I'm not an apologist for Descartes. I just think we got to be fair with him.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, that's huge. So this, I want to keep going on into unity of consciousness, and that's really a big one
Good.
for you. We talked about
Yeah.
consciousness. Can you explain, what is the unity of consciousness or the consciousness problem?
Good. So in particular, so in theories of unity, there's a distinction that tracks the access and phenomenal consciousness. So there'll be access, access conscious that's unified, and there will be phenomenal conscious that's unified. So I'm interested in the phenomenal unity of consciousness.
Yeah.
And so one of the just examples that I use is throughout the chapter on this is that, imagine that you're in a museum and you have all of these experiences at once. The color of an experience of the redness of the painting, an experience of the depth of field that stands between you and say the wall and the painting, and then the frame that the painting has. And say that I'm sort of fidgeting with my pen as I look at this, and so I have a tactile experience, and say that I hear a conversation sort of off in the distance. The unity of phenomenal consciousness is points out to the fact that it seems quite obvious that there is a state where all of those things are totalized together that are not reducible to those individual states.
Yeah.
So you have all these different kinds of phenomenal consciousness that are bound together in one state, and that's what I experience. So not only is there, because in the way to see that that's not merely an aggregation of the bits, is that it's not that I have an experience of redness or any of those other experiences that I listed, the pen, the sound, the smell of coffee. It's that there's what it's like to experience all of those as one state.
Yeah.
And so that's what's generally thought, or that's the datum that's trying to be explained in the debates about the phenomenal unity of consciousness, is that I have this, I experience a state that is not merely an aggregation of parts.
Yeah.
That there's what it's like to experience all of these at once, and that's one unified state of consciousness.
Yeah, that reminds me of
metaphysically unified.
Yeah, there's a debate. I believe maybe it's old hat because I'm coming in late, but Searle would say, yeah, like there's one qualia experience, kind of like one qualia maybe, and you're not like carving out different qualia from that. Whereas other people, I think, are saying no, there's all these different qualia. Like there's what it's like to see this apple, and then you have all these other things in your field, and
Right.
I think he's saying there's like this. I think Searle would say there's like this unified. You can't carve it out because that's just what consciousness is. It is this qualia, and maybe he's getting different there. But it reminded me of what you were saying.
No, he definitely is. Here's a quote in chapter 4, chapter 4. He says, "It's absolutely essential to understand that consciousness is not divisible in the way that physical objects typically are. Rather, consciousness always comes in discrete units of unified conscious field." Yeah, that's exactly what he's going to. And he thinks, and I think he's right, that if you're going to solve the problem of consciousness, this is part of the problem.
Yes.
And so I'm convinced that the unity of phenomenal consciousness is actually a harder problem than the mere hard problem of phenomenal consciousness.
That's huge. Yeah, I really like that. I was first introduced to this because I really like the argument from reason, C.S. Lewis. I really like transcendental arguments from Van Til, though I don't think he really made a lot himself, but he kind of put forward the model for it. I think C.S. Lewis kind of follows that model. I'm writing a paper when we're done with this on that.
Great.
And following through Davidson. Yeah, that'd be awesome. It's terrifying, but that would be awesome. But Victor Reppert talks about the binding problem, and is that the same? Is that the same thing? The binding problem is the problem of the unity of consciousness, or is that different?
Yeah, so the binding problem is a problem in the neurosciences, and it is probably the most difficult problem to work on now. And the binding problem has to do with the so one way to think about it is the binding problem is a problem about the neural mechanisms of a unified state of consciousness, where the unity of phenomenal consciousness is usually cast in a problem about the mental state itself.
Okay.
So the neuroscientists, what they're trying to do is, and I get into this, in the book, that there are we've discovered that there are various regions of the brain that are responsible, that are segregated from each other and responsible for specific kinds of perception.
Yeah.
Right. So we know if you have a particular lesion in a region called V4, then you can lose your color perception. If you have a lesion in region IT, then you can lose the ability to identify shapes. And so what that tells us, there are discrete parts of the brain that are correlated with different types of experience.
Yeah.
But what we don't have is any sort of indication that they're bound together as one experience. There's no mechanism or part of the brain that binds these things together into one experience.
It's just the pineal gland. Isn't it the pineal gland? Isn't that?
Yeah, I mean, no, it's not.
Yeah.
And the thing that I find fascinating, and it's so funny, like what other philosophers find like interesting. But I gave this talk one time, and Alex Proust, I mean, he, I studied with him, and he's this great big old genius guy, right? Yeah. He's sort of like the Planning of our time, I think. I said this one thing that I thought was like a throwaway line, and he's like, "That's fascinating," and I start to think that he's right now. And the comment that I made was, the binding problem is showing us that the more and more we learn about the brain, the more aggregated its structure is becoming. And so the less probable the solution to the binding problem becomes, because we're finding more things that need to be bound together.
Yes. And
so the more we learn about neuroscience, the more mysterious phenomenal consciousness becomes.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was like an aside, and Alex thought it was really interesting. And I'm starting to think that is interesting now too, because what you get now is the thing that most physicalists or naturalists want to say is wrong with dualism, and that's that there's no explanatory value in the theory. But it does have explanatory value in this sense. If dualism is true, substance dualism is or certain kinds of substance dualism is true, then we wouldn't expect there to be a binding problem at all.
Yeah.
But if physicalism is true, then we should expect here's a different way to put it. Maybe that wasn't the best way to put it. If substance dualism is true, we should expect our conscious states to be phenomenally unified.
Yeah.
Because there's a simple soul that has them, that's not comprised of separable parts. But if you assume physicalism, the opposite should be true, and that's that you've got all these discrete mental states that are dispersed over a multitude of neurological parts. And so what you end up having a case is, if physicalism is true, we shouldn't have the sort of conscious states that we do.
Yeah.
But if dualism is true, this is how we should expect the world to be.
Yeah. Just real quick, I have a giant African bullfrog, and he keeps croaking. So just so all the listeners know, that's not me. That's not any biological thing. That's just a frog croaking. Yeah. I think he likes you. But so that I love that problem. That's why I think that the unity of consciousness and it being grounded in a substantial soul or a unified soul answers this binding problem, because you're like in a cockpit of an airplane trying to say, like, how does this thing fly? You have all the mechanisms here, but there's no one here to do it. And you're never going to find that without the pilot. I know that's probably a bad analogy, because we don't want to say like the soul is a ghost in the machine kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it kind of like, yeah, it kind of is. Like there's a person there that you're looking for that you're not going to find in the brain.
No, I think that's a really good insight. I mean, because you've just stated Leibniz's mill argument in a different way. You've stated it with a plane. So he says, look, imagine that the mind or the brain is like a mill, and you're shrunk down and you go inside of it. You look around the mill and all of its parts and the structures, the external relations among the parts, and you're not going to find a subject of consciousness there. Yeah, it's same point.
I think maybe William Lane Craig said this before about a piano. I'm not sure if he did or not, but like you're on the inside of the piano and you see all the keys going, and you're like, yeah, this is how it happens. When that thing goes, this song plays, and this goes, and you hear the song, but you're on the inside and you're not seeing the person on the other side who's playing the piano. I think that
doesn't work though, because you've got player pianos, right, that play themselves.
Yeah, that's true.
So
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I'm gonna scratch that, everybody.
I mean, okay, so now here's the bizarre thing, though, is Christopher Tomaszewski, who's, brilliant. I've learned tons by studying with him at Baylor. We were in the same cohort. He's another grad student at Baylor. We were taking this class with John Haldane, and Haldane was talking philosophy of mind, and he was talking about how intentional states are things that only minds can have, and robots can't have them. And Christopher says, "So you're trying to tell me that robots can't walk?" And Haldane says, "Yeah." And it's a funny sort of way of framing it, because you can say, no, look, I see that robot walking right there. But the point is much like playing a piano isn't reducible to the moving functions of the keys.
Right.
It's actually an intentional state to play a particular kind of music, just like walking is an intentional state to move your body to achieve some goal.
Yeah.
Those intentional states are not the sorts of things that are properties of machines.
Yeah.
And so you might say that, no, that's right. The player piano doesn't play music.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, they're just outputs that sound, that are behaviorally look and sound just like music.
Yeah. I think I just finished up my master's thesis, and I had to go through analogy, because I worked on a authorial analogy and metaphor. And I think initially I wanted to say, well, it's an analogical sense, but it's not. It's that robot is walking and the piano is playing in a metaphorical sense, which is literally false. It's not actually doing that, but you can think of it, or maybe like an intuition pump, like it's as if it is, or something like that. But really because a human mind programmed it to do that.
Right.
And yeah, it has like, this is what I love about Searle's Chinese room argument. It has like observer relative. Well, he's talking about thoughts and stuff, but like observer relative, that thing's walking because we're interpreting it as walking. But maybe it doesn't have observer independence because it's not a mind. It doesn't have intentional states itself.
Right. Yeah. And so I think the right way to look at the Chinese room argument is from the first person experience of the person in the room.
Yeah.
And his is about meaning, but I think that I think that his argument actually rides on an assumption about the unity of phenomenal consciousness too.
Nice, dude. I love it. It all comes back.
Yeah, David Barnett points that out, so I'm not the one who discovered that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Brendan, you feel like we can wrap up this episode, or do you have anything else to add on consciousness before we jump into part 2?
No. This is great. I think maybe one thing we might want to just state briefly is sort of the mereological relations, but I think we can. Yeah, let's do that at the next session.
Awesome. Well, dude, thanks for coming on in episode 1 here. This has been fantastic. For our listeners, jump right into to part 2. We're going to be talking about naturalism. We're talking about mereology, wholes and part relations, and lots more awesome stuff. So, Brendan, thanks for coming on. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.